Yep.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Okay, good morning, and welcome to the Zero Trust for the Enterprise Endpoint web event today, hosted for you by Forrester Research and by AppGuard. We appreciate your attendance today. We have with us today Dr. Chase Cunningham, distinguished analyst and principal architect from Forrester Research, myself, Jim Skidmore from AppGuard, and AppGuard Director of Field Marketing, Eric Iverson, as we discuss Zero Trust for the Enterprise Endpoint to slash risks, and cyber costs. Okay. So very quickly, we're going to begin with Forrester Research, as I mentioned, Principal Analyst Dr. Chase Cunningham, who's going to basically discuss Forrester's paradigm with regard to Zero Trust and what it means in kind of the cyber world today. So Chase, welcome, and thank you.
Yeah, great. Thank you for having me. Really looking forward to talking about all this Zero Trust and endpoint stuff. This is going to be an interesting session. We haven't had a whole lot of conversations around Zero Trust at the endpoint, so this is kind of a first shot over the bow. So, getting into the whole wrapping your head around why this sort of Zero Trust thing is taking off and how Zero Trust is sort of proliferating as a strategy for everybody. Let's abstract away from that a bit and think about something crazy that happened, right? If everybody's seen the movie Jurassic Park, which I'm sure you probably have, I like to put this slide up whenever I do speeches because it really does drive the point home. While it's a bit comical, Jurassic Park, right? Unlimited resources, spared no expense. I mean, they created dinosaurs out of frog DNA, and they had one IT guy that ran everything. And of course, if you remember the movie, we all saw how well it worked out for everybody on the island that they had one IT guy running all the networks. And funny enough, this is actually the same sort of paradigm and management scenario that you see in organizations all over the world. At Forrester, we do lots of conversations and lots of consulting and inquiries with different organizations that have, millions of dollars spent in security, if not more. And often when we start talking to them and digging into the sort of, who's running things, who's managing things, really, they usually have like one or two or three people that are the key holders for the entire enterprise. And the speed and scale with which we do things nowadays, you really can't survive if you're going at it with one individual or two or three. It's not fair to that person. It's really hard to do. And with, the way things develop and get put online nowadays, it's dang near impossible to be good at what you're trying to do when the bad guys can come at any angle at any time. This is where Zero Trust comes in, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. So on the next slide. So, driving that point home a little bit more, the realities around what's going on in the space is that managing security is actually getting harder, not easier. And this is from a survey that we did recently with VMware to sort of break down the differences between 2015 and 2017. So compared to last year, do you feel your infrastructure is more or less susceptible to security threats? In 2015, we asked that question, and it was basically 1 in 4 folks kind of said, well, I think we're more susceptible to threats. But now, 2017, it's basically 1 in 2, 50% of those folks say, we realize that we are more susceptible to threats. And these are, big companies with at least 500 plus employees that are doing lots and lots of things all over the world. And it shows very clearly that while this is probably a factor of, number one, organizations starting to understand that the threat space is evolving and that security controls are becoming more sort of spread out and dispersed, and the threats are finding new and more sort of easy accesses to come after organizations, that the threat is getting bigger, the threat space is getting bigger, proliferation of wireless technologies, crazy app development cycles, rollout of IoT and things like that has made the threat space much, much bigger and has made it very, very hard to do this right at speed and at scale. And I can guarantee you that when we come back and do this survey again in 2019, we're going to see the same thing. It's probably going to be more like 3 out of 4 or 4 out of 4 because people are starting to actually understand the threat space is growing and evolving, and it's getting really, really hard to do this right. On to the next slide, please. But the crazy thing when you break that down and you sort of take a step back from it, when you say, okay, well, if it's getting harder to do this at speed and at scale, and you're having more issues around security and we continue to have breaches, it must be that there's something really different going on. It must be crazy that there's some, new hacker shenanigan that's taking place in the last years or so, where they're going after different things, they're exploiting other avenues, they're targeting different ideas and things like that. No, it's really not. It's the same stuff. It's basic blocking and tackling. So if you look at how were most organizations breached, and we've done those studies, most of them were done by external means. Yeah, there are some internal stuff that happens, but the majority of the breaches that occur happen externally. And when those do happen, how did they actually get carried out? Well, we went and asked. Most of them came back as either phishing, ransomware, or social engineering. There's some web exploits, there's some vulnerabilities and software stuff, but the simple fact of the matter is the tried and true exploitation lifecycle is still the same as it was 10 years ago. So, manufacturing, retail, public sector, and healthcare, telecom, and financial, everybody's still in the same buckets. Everyone's still being targeted with the same things, but it still is becoming a fail point for organizations across the board. And no one's doing anything really that amazing in the threat space. They come up with good malware, they send individuals, they do some online recon and figure out who they're going after, and they target the endpoint and get access and start from there. Rarely is it coming from, someone doing some really whiz-bang, super awesome Jason Bourne type thing on mainframes and whatever else. They don't even bother with that, because the reality of it is, if I'm a bad guy and I do a little bit of homework and figure out my target, and I send a well-crafted malicious attachment or email or whatever to the endpoint, sooner or later I'm going to get my fish, and then I can just work my way in from there. So it's interesting to me to see that even though we have this proliferation of security and this growth of artificial intelligence and all this other stuff going on in space, the same blocking and tackling for the bad guys is still working. So that means one of two things: either strategically organizations aren't doing things right, or we just have really, really bad technology that's trying to stop this from occurring. I don't think anyone that's spending money in this space thinks that it's the technology that's the problem. It's the strategy. It's the fact that we're not doing those basic things very well, and that organizations might not have the correct strategy in place to actually defend themselves when it comes to using that technology. Before I retired out of the military, one of the colonels I used to work for would say he'd say, Tiger Woods could play scratch golf with my clubs, but I couldn't play scratch golf with Tiger Woods clubs. So it's not about the tools, it's about how you use them and how well you know how to use them, and whether or not that's mapped to a clear and concise strategy that you can put in place and rally the troops around to actually defend the enterprise. And the goal that we've talked about in security for a long time has been defense in depth and those type of things. And really, what we're trying to do is take back ground from the enemy and keep them as far out from the core of the network as we possibly can. And that actually will start as far out as the endpoint if you approach it correctly. Next slide, please. So when you do have a breach, we ask the question, okay, well, when you've been attacked, when those basic blocking and tackling things have failed and you've been hit, what have you done? Have you actually taken that action? Pretty much everybody comes back and say, yes, they've done something. They either hire additional staff, which seems like a lot of them tend to do that, especially in small, mid-sized business. They add two-factor. They increase spending on preventive technologies. They usually wind up doing more auditing, increase spending on network detection as well. But you notice, if you look at what's going on in this particular slide, they really try and do everything across as much of the stack as they can. They're hiring staff, they're putting prevention stuff in place, they're doing auditing, then they go to the network, they try and outsource from SSP, and then they spend some money on endpoint detection technology as well, and then they try and throw some two-factor in there at the last sort of stretch of this. The interesting thing about that is they're trying to do a lot of things across the board to try and address a problem that is not nearly as complex as what they're making it. If these organizations would actually look at where the compromise started, where the avenues of exploitation came in, it would boil down to just a few things. You take care of the endpoint, you take care of the network, and you take care of the users. And other than that, you can actually keep the bad guys pretty far out. Now, some of the things like two-factor and other solutions address those in some way, but the reality of it is usually what happens, and you can see it here, it's a shotgun approach of, we've been breached, this is bad, we have really big problems, let's go throw everything we can at the issue and see if we can get it right next time. And this is why the bad guys continue to stay in the environment, why they dig deeper, why they move laterally, things like that, because they're going after it with a singular focus, after a singular effect, to do things with a very dialed in approach. The good guys, unfortunately, are trying to solve every problem at once, and it's just not possible. You can't do it, especially with that one IT guy sitting back there, toking and joking and just waiting for things to go his way. Next slide, please. Finally, a couple of more points here on sort of where things go when breaches happen and when they're actually dialing in on it. Enterprises will invest equally on endpoint threat prevention and detection. So anti-malware, file encryption, data leak, packet management, application whitelisting, integrity, user behavior monitoring analytics. All this is great, and you see that it's implementing or planning to implement pretty much. But back to that point I made before, this is still a shotgun approach to a problem that they probably can't keep up with at speed and at scale in most instances anyway, if they're not using the right technology or the right solution that integrates this stuff and takes the problem out of the hands managerially from the folks who are running those networks, running those systems, defending that enterprise. I've been a SOC operator for the military, and I've been a SOC operator and run SOCs commercially. And I can tell you, it's really, really hard to do this right at any speed and at any scale, especially when you're trying to use solutions that don't integrate, optimize, and integrate all of these types of things that you need. And back to that point a couple slides ago, organizations can't do this correctly because it is so spread out, it is so dispersed, and they're trying to go after so many things at once, usually with sort of Frankenstein networks that may or may not have been collected, and half-baked solutions that may or may not dial in on the specifics of the threat. And most of the time, it's also tied to the fact that they don't strategically plan what they're going to do to try and drive the bad guys out of the environment. They're just putting band-aids on an artery and hoping that they can get enough band-aids on there to stop the flow of blood. And obviously, that's not going to work. Next slide, please. So when they are looking at these enterprise-based solutions, just to give you a little bit of insight into what buyers are actually looking for, because there is a movement towards endpoint security to try and address these issues, it seems to be a pretty big gap between what they thought that they needed and what they actually need and want now. It used to be years ago that traditional endpoint security was good at sort of well-known stuff, signature-based malware threats. It was focusing on preventing bad things from happening at the file level, didn't have any behavioral connectivity going on, and it also didn't work very well when it was off network. It worked okay if you had your system and everything was connected to your current network, but the moment you moved off, it sort of went failed by the wayside. The current generation we have today seems to be doing pretty well at some zero-day security, things like that, process-based behavioral. They've got sort of the on and off network thing going because organizations have realized that we have a mobile workforce nowadays, and you need to be able to do on and off network and things like that. And then they're also doing some visibility into running processes. And then finally, further on, what's coming in the near future, and some organizations and some vendors are starting to share this now, is stuff that's very focused on zero-day malware protection, fileless malware protection, full visibility, process and user-based behavioral detection, because a lot of times that's where you'll see when somebody's doing something malicious, or maybe they don't even know that they're infected, and you'll notice that things are going on weird with their machine and connections and items like that. And then a low threshold for required security skill set. And personally, I think that's one of the most important pieces for next generation endpoint security, is that security can't be hard, it can't be difficult, and it honestly, if you're doing it right, the user probably is not even going to know that it's running on their system, because the moment that people sort of gripe about performances, or they think that there's a problem, or they're not sure what's going on, all of a sudden security becomes useless, because the first time that that's a problem, you're going to have to go fix it, and it just takes time away from the security life cycle and things like that. So ultimate goal, everybody wants to be in this next generation stack for endpoint security. Next slide, please. Just a little bit more on this, not to beat a dead horse, but advanced endpoint security capabilities that folks are asking about when they're calling to talk to us at Forrester, looking for pre-execution and post-execution protection. Like, what do they do before? How do we know it's defending? Okay, well, this malware showed up. Now what is it doing? How do we respond? Pattern recognition and classification, lots of machine learning, sort of artificial intelligence, entity-based analysis, baselining, which is very useful for determining when things are going on, because it solves that sort of problem of speed and scale, right? They can have a lot of capability without a lot of human beings. Looking at user and process behavior, because again, that's a corollary that's very useful and allows you to sort of get some insight into what actually is anomalous within that activity. Lots of automated response integration. Basically, we've moved from the days of, I don't know how to fix this and I'm going to manually go in and do remediation and blah, 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 to now at speed and at scale. Malware usually only does one of a couple things. So if that malware shows up, I want you to do something to mitigate that system for me as automated as possible, because I don't have the capability of putting people in there to do investigation on every single file that shows up that may be malicious. It's just not going to work. And then on and off network efficacy. We live in a mobile workforce. You've got devices, you've got people moving all over the world, you've got people that work at home, people that work at the office. Any effective solution that you're going to have in this scenario is going to have some sort of capability that maps to being on and off network. It's got to perform the same way regardless of where they're at. So now we've got through sort of the endpoint stuff. We've talked about some of the proliferation of the threat space and whatnot. Let's talk a little bit more about where zero trust ties into this and what it means for this in this particular context. So breaking this down, right, zero trust enables business by adapting security architecture to support user populations, engagement models, rapid cloud adoption, and new devices. Basically, what we're talking about there is that zero trust is a very useful strategic initiative that you can put in place to drive these type of things over the finish line. Beyond Corp is Google's version of zero trust, and it works very, very well for them. They've got lots of case studies out there about using zero trust, or they call it Beyond Corp, but let's be real about it. It's the same thing. Organizations as large as NASA are using zero trust, and other giant companies across the world are doing zero trust, because simply put, it works pretty concisely. We're talking about improving visibility because we're dialing in on what we can and can't see, and where we can't see, we segment, isolate, and then focus on making things more visible. We stop malware propagation, we stop lateral movement, right? East-west traffic, those type of things. The goal of zero trust really is to try and flip things from CapEx to OpEx as much as possible, reducing the scope and cost of compliance initiatives, because that way you're actually able to go back to the auditor, to the compliance people, and say, we've implemented zero trust around this infrastructure. This is where we actually have to do compliance, not the entire network. We're getting away from silo finger pointing so that folks don't say, well, that's their area of the network, this is mine, they don't do this, I don't do that. And if you've got 2 or 3 IT guys that are running things and something goes wrong, you can see real quickly how folks are going to say, well, that's not me, that's them. Looking for data awareness and insight, because that's the reality of the threat space, right? No one breaks into a bank to say that they're in a building. People break into a bank to say, have them to steal the money. Same thing with networks. If someone breaks in, they're coming after data. They're not there just because they could say that they were showing up and doing bad things, for the most case. Getting the data away from being taken by the bad guys, because in the reality of what Zero Trust tries to drive home. I'll tell people all the time, like, I'm not trying to figure out how to secure everything all the time and be perfect. The reality of it is, if I can just secure what would ruin the company based on the data that is toxic, then we've done a really good job of implementing zero trust controls, because you're not going to show up on the cover of USA Today for someone taking the data that would have ruined your company. And then enabling digital business transformation so that you can do this a little bit more strategically and improve security along the way, so that you're not literally proliferating the threat within your own environment. Next slide. So just to get the point across of how big zero trust is sort of taking off, and then I'm not actually just tooting my own horn here. We went out and asked 100 organizations, and this was done in March of this year, what their familiarity was with zero trust. Like, are they aware of it? Does it matter to them? Is it useful? Almost half of them said that they sort of know about it, but while they may not know about the actual term zero trust itself, they're actually putting it in place, sort of whether they like to admit it or not. So half of them say, yes, we know what zero trust is, and it makes sense for my organization. Another nearly half of those folks say, well, I don't know what zero trust necessarily means by definition, but I'm doing those things in my network anyway. So nearly everyone that we asked came back and said, yeah, I'm either familiar with zero trust and I'm doing it, or zero trust is something that I'm going to use further down the path. And that's interesting to know, because if you think about some of the companies that we deal with, we're talking big firms that all came back and said, some way, shape, or form, we're doing zero trust. And the point I like to make there is, if all these big companies are doing this with all that money, why shouldn't every organization that's doing it follow that same path? Next slide, please. All right, so after being shown the definition, pretty much everybody still says that they're working towards a zero trust approach, but a lot of them say, we're working towards that, we figured it out, we think it's a good solution, we like the strategic initiatives that are there, but they're not really doing it yet. It describes our approach. We are doing some of those things, but not all. Almost half the folks say that. And though it does describe our approach, we are planning to start some of those initiatives in the next 12 to 24 months. So again, not to beat the dead horse really, but the point here I'm trying to make is that even those organizations that are still sort of flirting with the idea of zero trust, in the next 12 months, they're moving towards it one way or the other. So it is not just a framework or just a thing that we've thrown out there that hasn't taken off. This is big deal, big business, and it's making a lot of sense and a lot of solutions for a lot of organizations. Next slide, please. And so why are they moving towards zero trust? Interestingly enough, if you ask organizations why they're even considering doing zero trust, most of them say compliance directives are looking at new strategies to put in place. We believe zero trust will improve our security architecture. Breaches have led us to zero trust. Lacking security skills, our board requested a clear strategic initiative. We're moving away from perimeter approach. So this slide, I'm trying to get the point across really, is that while compliance is the major driver to get organizations to move towards zero trust, because it makes things simpler, makes compliance more effective, and makes it sort of more assured that they're doing the right things, every reason that you could think of to leverage and try and do security, period, is actually being applied to these zero trust mantras and strategies. Whether it's breaches, whether it's changes in posture, whether it's the adoption of a perimeterless security application, or whether the board itself is actually saying we need a better strategy, the use of zero trust for enterprise endpoint infrastructure, network security, you name it, is taking off. It's growing, and it's being adopted across the landscape. Next slide. And finally, a couple more slides here on this whole thing is well, what are you actually going to get out of putting zero trust in place? And if you think about what really concerns organizations other than compliance, they're all freaked out about breaches. They think if they put zero trust in place and they do it right, it will minimize losses when a breach occurs and will reduce the frequency of breaches. That's a great thing, and I think that it's something very useful in a security platform. I think it's something that's good strategically. But if you look at the bottom of that sort of slide there, you'll see that some organizations are actually seeing that, if we do this whole zero trust thing and we get better at security, which improves our, minimizes our threat of breaches and things like that, we're actually going to do better by the customer. We're going to do better by retention and acquisition. And if you've seen any of the stuff that's gone on lately with Facebook and Equifax and some of these other companies, privacy, data security, threat integrity, and the ability to respond to hacks and be better at taking care of customers' data has now come to the mainstream. I mean, I think Zuckerberg is testifying today, actually in front of Congress, about just how terrible they were at managing who was doing what on third-party systems within Facebook. And they're losing customers to this. They lost, I want to say, last number I saw was like 89 billion so far, just in how they were handling this and how big of an impact it was having on them. So it's a big deal. And the point there is having a clear strategic objective and a clearly well-defined strategy to put in place, like zero trust, where you're working from the inside out, focusing on the data, driving the bad guys as far out to the perimeter as possible, and taking care of those things such as endpoint, network, and user. You actually have a capability in place strategically that enables security to be better. Next slide. So that's my rundown on endpoint security, zero trust, and sort of where things are in my space. And I'll kick it over to the AppGuard team on their application of zero trust.
Great. Thank you very much, Chase. Much appreciated. Very informative, I think very eye-opening for a lot of community members out there in the security community. AppGuard is and always has been focused on addressing cyber challenges at the endpoint using our unique zero trust paradigm and approach. And we're going to talk briefly about that, and very quickly at the end of this component, we will take questions from the audience and ensure that we have enough time to get all those in. As we look at endpoint zero, as we like to call it, and the trust necessities that are out there, we learn that applications and utilities at any moment can be used, for exploit and fileless attacks. I think, as most of us are aware from what we've seen. From user space, adversaries can drop and launch malicious executables and scripts and all kinds of bad things. So we don't believe that user space should be able to launch things into system space, and that's going to be a big part of our paradigm today. From a malicious code detection perspective, detection relies on parsing infinite possibilities. If you've ever whitelisted or blacklisted, applications externally, and I think we're hearing it from a lot of people these days, that battle is really a battle that can kind of never be won. So, the zero trust aspect of this seems to be the only intelligent approach to ultimately win the war. OS authorization system, as we look at privileged escalation attacks, they're very routine in the wild now. And even internally, privileged escalation is an issue. If you look at end user foolishness, or maybe a better word would be unknown habits, This can be the root of many data breaches, and many people do have phishing awareness campaigns and other things out there, but they are still reacting. And the bottom line is, the world needs a better way to do this. Obviously, we have patch management is a required item, but basically we're still as fast as we can playing whack-a-mole with blind spots all over the place, hopefully with enough people that can execute the patch management in a timely fashion. It's never real time. It's hopefully near real time for you, but this has been exploited. And if you look at WannaCry and many other variants that have occurred over the past couple of years, they really relied on patch management diligence being low in a lot of organizations. From an incident detection and response perspective, again, to support the zero trust paradigm, 2017, the costs were pretty much double what they were in 2015. So this is basically telling you that, this is not going to go down, right? I mean, if the detect and respond way is the way that people choose to go forward, it's going to become increasingly more expensive as the exploits grow and the attackers grow. Okay, could go on to the next one, please. Okay, so Eric Iverson will explain a little bit about how AppGuard blocks non-policy conforming actions. And again, we'll do this briefly and have a discussion afterwards. Thanks. Eric?
Well, hello, everybody. So basically, all malicious code attacks have some kind of a starting place. It might be exploiting a vulnerability in application. It might be utilizing some legitimate utility like PowerShell already on the endpoint, or user space. And basically, AppGuard's name, AppGuard, is based on the premise that we don't trust those applications or those utilities or user space. We place them under guard. And one of the challenges here is that a lot of tools have come and gone, but they just don't adapt to endpoint change. Endpoints are always changing. Those patches, feature updates, et cetera, et cetera. So what we're going to show you here is that by starting at one of the beginning points, and we place all of the beginning points under guard, we're able to both adapt to those endpoint changes, so you don't need policy updates all the time. In fact, AppGuard agents in the wild typically go without any form of update for months at a time. So what we have here is we're starting with Microsoft Word. Now, Microsoft Word is often subject to either application exploit attacks or non-malware attacks, i.e. weaponized documents. And so the way AppGuard approaches this is, by policy, we place Microsoft Word under guard. But Microsoft Word isn't just a single executable. It's a whole family of executables, libraries, script engines, et cetera, et cetera. So the patented technology of AppGuard is such that when you put the parent under guard, then whatever grandchildren or children follow, they too dynamically become under guard. So what's happened after, say, an end user clicks on a weaponized Word document, the operating system kicks off Microsoft Word, and then Word launches its various children and executables and libraries and script engines and stuff. And as those little AppGuard icons are indicating, AppGuard is seeing all of that. And what AppGuard is doing is it's acting like a kernel-level traffic cop down there, and it's basically making real-time yes-no decisions. So what does this mean? Well, for Microsoft Word and its family to interact with anything else on the endpoint, say to open and write a file or read a memory location or change a registry key, they basically have to communicate that intent to the operating system kernel, which then facilitates it. Well, with AppGuard as a lightweight driver sitting down there at the kernel level, it's making that real-time yes or no decision as to whether or not to allow that to happen. And so basically what AppGuard is doing is it's blocking those unacceptable actions that might take place at any given moment. It might be changing a registry key, altering files or adding files somewhere into, say, a Windows directory, or injecting code into another application's memory to transform it into something else. Or how about this? Pass the hash, pass the ticket attacks by scraping the memory of that Windows LSAS process. AppGuard blocks all of these things in real time, and it does so by adapting to all the endpoint changes that are always happening. It's as close to set and forget as you're likely to see. You might think, having experienced, say, sandboxing or process virtualization and other kind of heavy, cumbersome tools, that AppGuard might be a bit heavy and slow down machines, but it actually couldn't be farther from the truth. Its driver is only about 760 kilobytes on the hard drive, and in actual use out on in the wild, the agent itself is consuming usually 0.0%. You rarely see it go over 0.1%. As for RAM, it's only consuming about 10 megabytes of RAM. It's easily one of the lightest weight protection tools out there, if not the lightest weight tool. So if you are working with non-persistent or persistent VDI implementations, and then you've experienced the security penalty, where the security agent or agents are limiting the number of sessions that your servers can sustain. With AppGuard, that security penalty is practically zero. So we talked about placing user space under guard. I'm sure you've heard about drive-by download attacks and such, where scripts or executables they launch from user space, and then they do bad things such as install persistent software. Well, AppGuard is kind of like some other tools in that it doesn't allow untrustworthy things to launch from user space, but it and we use mechanisms like digital signatures by trusted publishers and such to identify those executables and things that we do allow to launch from user space. But whereas other tools stop with whether or not they allow something to start or stop, AppGuard is just beginning. So here we see in the middle of this slide is GoToMeeting. And you see all those little AppGuard icons showing AppGuard is seeing everything that GoToMeeting has spawned and is placing each of those things under guard and is ensuring that even after launch, they cannot make changes to system space. They cannot mess with the memory of other applications. So it's very dynamic in its protection. And basically, this one set of cyber controls, placing user space, applications, and utilities under guard, blocks the vast majority of attacks. But, AppGuard is much more than this. In fact, we have a feature called Trusted Enclaves. It's yet another layer of protection that we provide to that Windows LSAS process. So even if somehow some malicious process sneaks in, it still can't access the memory of the LSAS process for that pass the hash attacks. That's just one of many other examples of some other zero trust cyber controls that we have in place. And so the gist of this is, with this type of protection, AppGuard is taking you into endpoint zero trust, where you no longer are having to chase infinite possibilities of telling good from bad files or normal from abnormal behavior. It finally gets you ahead of the curve so you can scale back or even outright eliminate that incident response workforce that is growing in numbers every year.
Okay, thanks, Eric. All right, so let's wrap up and understand some of the key benefits, really, with regard to what we're talking about in our zero trust paradigm. Some of the key benefits that AppGuard provides is we block all endpoint attacks, right? I mean, you'll hear people that are weaker or stronger on different ends, as Eric mentioned, whether it's in memory, fileless, polymorphic, whatever kind of malware exploit you're seeing, including pass the hash, AppGuard blocks them if things are not conforming to policy again. We have strong adaptiveness to endpoint changes, which reduces operations workload. And we know that, the endpoint changes occur very quickly and require a lot of to-dos. From a deployment perspective, AppGuard is very quick to deploy. We can deploy usually in a matter of days, but no deployment has ever taken more than 2 weeks with all of our customers around the world. We reversed the upward trend of detect and react costs as well. We understand that people keep adding more modules and more complexity to the standard detect and response posture that they're taking today, and that's only going to grow. From our perspective, costs actually go down, and that's a large reason why a lot of large organizations use AppGuard. We alleviate also patch management pressure, as we discussed earlier. We understand how difficult it is for our clients out there to stay current. But the good news is with AppGuard, they have firm knowledge that if the endpoint patch management process is working on a set of endpoints at a time, that the pressure's off in terms of an exploit violating that endpoint. Obviously, AppGuard always recommends best practice, security measures. So we don't want you to stop patching. We're merely stating that if you're having some challenges, we're there for you in the interim until things get patched correctly. Basically, no AppGuard user basically has any performance or overhead penalty or latency issue. As we discussed before, 760 KB on the endpoint. We never use more than about 10 meg of RAM. So basically, latency is not an issue. And people will take advantage of this even if they have a pre-existing endpoint security tool, because we basically don't, we multi-layer sometimes for some clients their endpoints, and they know that we'll be there on the goal line in the event that anything should happen to stop whatever the adversarial occurrence is. We protect enterprises from employee foolishness, as we said. Bottom line is, that's another battle that can kind of never be won. I think, the awareness campaigns are good, best practice, but in every case, week after week, month after month, we see some sort of phishing attack that occurred and somebody took the bait. We are a unique indicator of attack data, and we can feed any SIM with that IOA data. So that is something called AG Vision that's part of AppGuard. AppGuard also is as close to true set and forget operationally as anyone will ever see. We have to encourage our clients to upgrade their, for features and functions reasons, to upgrade their endpoint, software. But a lot of times they tell us, well, nothing's wrong, but we still want them to take advantage of the new features. Our administration, again, as Eric mentioned earlier, requires no specialist. So if we have competent Windows, administrators or like capability, they can handle AppGuard policy creation, which is not an overly difficult concept. And as I mentioned earlier, we play extremely well with anything else that might be on the endpoint from a security product perspective. We have done this many times before, and again, we do not impact latency. We do run into many clients who have very bloated endpoints and who are suffering from agent slowdown, and in many cases have had to even do tech refreshes and buy new equipment. So the good news is we stall that process as well. Okay.
So that's it for the presentation. We have a variety of questions that have come in while we've been speaking. The first one I see here, Jim, I'll ask you to take that one on, is where are you deployed?
Well, that's a good question. Yeah, we're since we were born in the federal government, Eric, sometimes we're not always known in every brand circle around the world, but we are deployed. AppGuard is deployed in over 100 countries around the world and has customers all over the world, from Asia to Latin America to Europe to the United States. So yeah, thanks for that question. We are involved, deployed in federal government space. We are deployed in large enterprise. We are deployed in mid-market and virtually every vertical market. So, okay, thanks for that.
Okay, so the next question is, does AppGuard protect client machines only, or is it a solution for servers? Why don't I take that one?
Sure.
So the answer is yes. AppGuard protects Windows servers of any flavor after, say, 2008 R something. And recently it's protecting Linux servers. Interesting thing about protecting servers is it is in some ways rather different from protecting client endpoints. One thing that's different about it is, well, a lot of organizations, they don't like their servers to have to be exposed to endpoints. And in those use cases, that's one way that AppGuard kind of shines, in that basically you can install the agent, put a policy in, and it really doesn't need to hear from the management system again. That said, I mean, it can and does. But basically what we're doing on the server is, whereas on the endpoint, the client endpoint, we're taking something of a process-centric approach and keeping an eye on all processes. It's a little different in servers in that we're actually getting rather more service-centric on seeing what services are running and what they're doing. But it's a very effective protection. Again, you don't have to restart the host to install AppGuard, and you don't need signatures of any kind, and it's just very effective. It blocks all forms of malicious code attacks on the endpoint, on the server, and it's great for protecting that LSAS process, because attackers just love to go and scrape privileged credentials from servers once they get on there. And AppGuard prevents that in real time, not detect and react fashion. Well, I think we already answered this question, but it asks about AppGuard's footprint compared to that of your competitors. I'll just say that competitor agents run up to something like 2 gigabytes in size. That's in part because, they're trying to do the all-in-one agent and such, and that does get a bit bloated after a while. And their memory and CPU footprints can be very high. Newer products are trending downward, but they're still pretty big. Next question is, how does AppGuard deal with fileless attacks? Well, first off, fileless attacks aren't always or literally fileless, but it's a common term, and we've got to live with it. But basically, what it means is that one or two tactics are involved in a fileless attacks. One of those tactics is keeping it all in memory. A lot of tools out there just don't play well in memory only. They operate well when they are looking at what's happening at the file system level. And so AppGuard plays very well in the in-memory level, and therefore it's because it's blocking those code injections or RAM scrapes. RAM scrapes, you may not realize it, but you're actually seeing it in the headlines a lot, where POS machines on retailers, their memory gets scraped by malware on their point of sale machine that is grabbing credit card data from the memory of the POS application. The other tactic that is associated with fileless attacks are what we call non-malware actions. And basically, they're making use of the legitimate utilities already on the endpoint. That's PowerShell, the command shell, the WScript utility for, say, VBS or what. and a number of other utilities. And so that explains why we don't just place applications under guard to prevent them from being exploited and used to do bad things. We also place utilities under guard.
Okay. Yeah, by the way, the pass the hash question came in along with that too, in similar fashion.
Okay, supported platforms. Jim, you want to take that?
Yep. Supported platforms currently, as we've mentioned earlier, we are wholly focused on Windows, and that includes XP to current Rev, both on the server and endpoint side. Also, we are focused now on Linux, and that includes every flavor, so not just Red Hat or SUSE or one or two. The way that we work basically supports all Linux versions. We also protect virtual, both from a persistent and non-persistent VDI perspective, endpoint assets that are virtualized. So if you have VDI desktops, Zen, Zero, whatever your favorite flavor is, AppGuard supports those as well. So to answer your question. Oh, we have another one, Eric. If you want to take this one, does AppGuard protection support containers in the cloud?
That's one of our newest capabilities in development, and it's really quite similar in concept to everything else. Again, zero trust is about compartmentalizing and limiting how things move from one compartment to another or interact with one compartment, etc. And the whole point of this compartmentalization approach of zero trust is to get you away from the cat and mouse game of chasing infinity that's driving up your labor hours, having to detect and react. The most evident manifestation of that are all those people having to sift through all of those alerts, half of which go uninvestigated. So with containers and the cloud technology that they're associated with, AppGuard, in effect, places those containers under guard. It's kind of a metaphor to what you see on the endpoint. On the endpoint, we place processes under guard, and then whatever process a guarded process spawns, that too falls under guard. And then like that on servers, whenever a service is placed under guard, any service that it might spawn falls under guard. And so in the cloud, regardless of where the actual containers are located, if one guarded container spawns another guarded container, that too becomes guarded. And so, the overall pattern here is, in addition to not having to chase infinity, it's not having to chase the constant tweaks and tuning that so many of our cybersecurity tools demand. Again, with AppGuard agents out in the field, it's very typical to see AppGuard agents go without any kind of policy update for months at a time. And in fact, on ATM deployments all over the world, you've got AppGuard agents on ATMs that are network isolated. And while they do allow patches to those machines, there's little to no other types of communication to and from those endpoints. And so AppGuard is able to protect those endpoints even in that network isolated manner. So it's very exciting. Is there anything you wanted to add about that container thing, Jim?
No, I think you wrapped it up and summed it up nicely. I was thinking about bringing up the ATM part, but you've obviously wrapped that up too, so that's great. And I would also say, I think that is the last question that we have.
Well, so, actually, we've got one more, Jim.
One more?
Yeah.
There you go.
Doing sandboxing technology. The short answer is no, but it is understandable that you might think so. I guess there's another market research firm out there they categorize AppGuard in two different ways: application whitelisting and isolation containment. And while AppGuard does behave or enforce isolation containment, it doesn't actually use those heavy sandboxing methods. A lot of people don't realize this, but if you're relying on host-based sandboxing, you're having to make tough choices about, do I implement, say, that update to Google Chrome and then turn off the sandbox, or do I keep the sandbox on and not update Google Chrome? Because sandboxing has to be finely tuned to the application it sandboxes. AppGuard does what it does without having to be tuned in such a way. So,
all right, great.
Yeah.
All right, great answer. Okay. Well, I do see that we're, I think, out of questions at this time. We are also almost up against the top of the hour here. So, we really wanted to thank everybody for their attendance today, and we are available to answer further questions about AppGuard. And obviously wanted to say on behalf of myself, Jim Skidmore, Eric Iverson, also from AppGuard, and special thanks to Dr. Chase Cunningham from Forrester Research for joining us today. We bid you farewell. We will be at RSA, if anybody should be there, in 2620 and all about, if you would like to talk to us about anything. And we are obviously reachable for web recording and other requirements that you may have from this session. So again, on behalf of all of us, thank you very much for attending today, and we hope you have a great day.